Fear not, I am your God. We live in an era of fear. And so in our home group studies this term, we are going to listen carefully to the reassurances of Isaiah chapters 40 to 45. Some of you will be studying in an online group meeting, others in pairs or in families perhaps, others alone. But rather than drop anyone blind into the middle of this enormous book, I've made this short video to orient us all. Now, a first aid kit is always a good idea in case of unforeseen emergencies. Yet the prophet Isaiah foresaw certain calamity. And so he packs not so much a first aid kit, but an entire A&E suite into chapters 40 to 66, with life support machine to sustain Israel through the trauma, and a defibrillator to revive them from near spiritual death. And we must also say that these chapters are filled with the presence of the only doctor who is qualified to administer the medicine. Well, Isaiah chapters 1 to 39 were written for Isaiah's own time. In the foreground is the threat posed by the superpower of the day, back in the 8th century BC, Assyria. The Assyrian army, in fact, came right up to Judah's neck, besieging Jerusalem, but the Lord delivered Jerusalem and the nation was spared. But the end of chapter 39 announces a new threat, Babylon. And this time the attackers will not stop at the neck. Babylon will sack Jerusalem, dismantle the royal house of David, torch the temple and exile the nation's leaders. It's still 150 to 200 years in the future. But chapters 40 to 66 are written to equip God's people for that future time. Now, since the 19th century, the mainstream of academic Bible scholars have considered all that impossible. They say it's unreasonable to think that God would precisely predict future events. Even if he could, he wouldn't want to. Yet, Isaiah chapters 40 to 66 does speak in detail about a situation beyond Isaiah's own day, even mentioning the name of the Persian prince who would allow the exiles to return home, Cyrus. So academic theology now takes for granted that these chapters must have been written 150 to 200 years after chapters 1 to 39. In other words, they're written by a second Isaiah who knew about Babylon's victory and about the Persian prince Cyrus. But I think we've got to question their assumption. What do they mean the Lord can't predict precisely the future? The message of these chapters actually depends on him doing so. As we're going to see, the argument rests on the fact that the Lord had predicted the events of the Babylonian period 200 years beforehand in the writings of Isaiah. See, these chapters base their summons to trust the Lord on his unique power over history, which is demonstrated precisely in predicting the future. If he didn't predict, then the central reason to trust is taken away. So I take the view that the whole of Isaiah was written by Isaiah of Jerusalem back in the 8th century BC, 150 years before Babylon wrecked Judah and 200 years or so before Cyrus sent the exiles home. The same man who wrote chapters 1 to 39 about and for his own day also wrote chapters 40 to 66 about a future day that the Lord had already had well in hand. Well, I'm going to spend some time now introducing 4 key factors at play in chapters 40 to 66. They'll help us to navigate through this term's home group studies on chapters 40 to 45. So the first factor is this. There's a catastrophic event that will dominate everyone's horizon, namely Babylon's conquest. Well, at the time of writing, Babylon was a growing power. It was rather like the China of its day, whereas Assyria was the superpower, like I suppose the America of its day. But Babylon would take over and sweep all before her. For example, chapter 41 verse 2, one from the east has been stirred up who turns nations to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. God's nation, Judah, was delivered from Assyria by a last-minute miracle. But no matter how much he hoped for the same reprieve when Babylon came, the reprieve would never arrive. Babylon would conquer Judah just like Babylon conquered every other of the nations in the region. And worse still, throughout this section, it's clear that Jerusalem's God was the very one who had stirred up the Babylonians to judge them. So this forced them to ask disturbing questions. Where was God's particular love for her? What about her calling to be a light to the nations? It must have been tempting to give up hope. Yet, here's the second factor. The predictive word that would secure Israel's hopes. Where is that predictive word to be found? In Isaiah's prophecy itself. Because if the Lord had predicted the Babylonian invasion, and that invasion had then happened, then he is trustworthy. And so they could also trust his promises that a king would be raised up, one called Cyrus, to rescue them from Babylon and bring them back to Jerusalem. I'll put it another way. Babylon would deliver a terrible blow, but the blow itself confirmed the trustworthiness of the God who promised it was coming. And so the blow can be taken as the basis for new hope when the same God promises salvation and rescue. The Lord's ability to declare future judgment accurately is the guarantee that he can be trusted to bring future salvation. Well, his power is in stark contrast to the next factor we need to have in mind. Third, the insidious deception that will lure Israel's trust. Useless idols. The Lord holds past, present and future open in his hands. He directs events and announces them as he wishes. Yet how hard we find it to trust him. We find it easier to trust things that we can see and control. False gods, idols. And these chapters repeatedly humiliate the claims of idols. So for example, chapter 41 verses 22 to 24. Bring in your idols to tell us what is going to happen. To tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know the final outcome. Or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so that we may know you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. But you are less than nothing, and your works are utterly worthless. He who chooses you is detestable. There's a lot of passages like that. Isaiah knows human nature and the perennial temptation of the church towards idols, and especially to the conqueror's idols. They would lure Israel and claim her trust in this future day. And so Isaiah exposes them as thoroughly as possible. It's alarming how prone we are to idolatry and to fear. Isn't it depressing? Israel was supposed to trust the Lord and through faith to fulfill his calling to bless the world. How could that calling then ever be fulfilled? Well, that introduces us to the fourth great factor at play. Fourth, the unique servant who will accomplish Israel's calling, namely Christ alone. Throughout these chapters, Israel is often described as God's servant. So chapter 41, verse 8, for example, but you, O Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend. Israel is called to be the Lord's servant, to bring blessing to the world. But the servant nation is a fearful wreck. So in its place, one man steps forward, a unique servant, to represent and embody a nation of failed servants. We meet him for the first time, by that title at least, in chapter 42, verse 1. Here is my servant whom I uphold, says the Lord, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him and he will bring justice to the nations. And that introduces the first of four so-called servant songs, which culminate in the famous chapter 53. Who is this spirit-anointed servant? Well, if you read Isaiah from the beginning, you'll have met him many times already. It's the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of David, the wonderful Counselor, the Prince of Peace. He will stand in for Israel. He will be the servant of the Lord for her. Israel's light then will shine on the nations, but through this one man, Jesus Christ alone, as he fulfills her calling and destiny for her. Four factors then throughout these great chapters. Babylon's conquest, that's the catastrophic event that dominated everyone's horizon. Isaiah's prophecy, secondly, the predictive word that secured Israel's hope. And then the third factor, useless idols, which were the insidious deception that lured Israel's trust. And then fourth, Christ alone, who is the unique servant who will accomplish Israel's calling. Look out for these themes throughout this term's home group sessions. You know, I hope we can all take to heart in these fearful times where there's so much fear around, that we can take Isaiah's frequent summons to heart. So often in these chapters he says to us, fear not, do not be afraid. And that as we hear that summons not to fear and put our trust in the living God, we will find comfort through Jesus Christ, whom the prophet Isaiah proclaimed.